For every custom action figure, a few sacrifices must be made. Hey everyone, it's Rustbelt Collector here, and today in this video we are taking a look at an all-new custom Star Wars action figure that I made recently based off of the new Season 2 of The Bad Batch. If you have not seen the latest episodes, please go and watch those because there's going to be some minor spoilers here for one of the episodes with Crosshair in it, and I wouldn't want you to have that spoiled for you. But if you have seen it, then we're going to dive right into this new custom figure. And here he is, my custom version of Commander Mayday from the Bad Batch Season 2. Now, I've really not made a custom figure in quite a while, but when I saw this episode of the Bad Batch with Commander Mayday and his troops with all their fabric wraps all over their armor, it really got the creative juices flowing, and I decided I have to have this guy in my collection. Yes, Hasbro may someday in the next 10 years make a Commander Mayday, but I know they're not going to do it on a 2000s Clone Wars body, and I'm also very, very impatient. Now for this figure, I used all official Hasbro parts wherever possible, and there are a few places where I either sculpted or molded some pieces that I didn't want to use official products for. I will go over my process of sourcing parts for this figure, but first let's go over the different materials that I bought for this figure. For most of the paint here on the figure, I used Apple Barrel paint. You can find this brand at Walmart. It's very cheap. It's affordable, and it actually applies to figures pretty nicely. If it comes out a little bit thick, you can always add water and make it a little bit more of a smooth texture for really nice line work and whatever else you're doing for a custom paint job. I also use this for a black wash where I mixed maybe like a drop of black paint with about a tablespoon of water, mix that up very well, and that makes for a nice paint wash, which is how you bring out a lot of the texture and detail in a custom figure. I also used this gloss varnish from Vallejo Paints. I used it only in two places, and that would be the visor of his helmet, just to give it a little bit more of a shine, as well as the eyes of the custom head sculpt that I made for this figure. For all of the different straps and pieces of fabric and belt buckles and pouches, I used green stuff. This is a two-part mix epoxy, so you get it in this packaging here. As you can see, it's called green stuff. I'm not just making that up. You cut off how much you want, and then you mix the blue and the yellow together, making a nice solid green moldable flexible clay that you can then sculpt and apply to your figures just like I did here, and then just wait for it to dry. Then you can paint it and do whatever else you need to do to it. I really like green stuff. It's very easy to use, and I feel like, you know, it just takes a little bit of practice to get used to the dry times and how to really get the best, smoothest results from it. But that all comes with practice and using this, so if you're doing a custom molded project, I highly recommend getting some green stuff. Once I had this figure sculpted, painted, and weathered to my liking, I used Krylon UV resistant clear coat in the matte finish, as you can see on the cap there. This was actually my first figure that I've ever used this on, but I really like its finish. It came out very nice and matte, as it should, but I've used matte clear coats before and sometimes had a little bit of gloss coming off of them. This looks almost exactly like it did before I even clear coated it, so that is exactly the result I wanted. I'm very happy with that. The paint hasn't chipped off, even on places like the arms and elbows where there's a lot of paint rub. So in the future, I definitely plan to use Krylon again for my custom figures. And then of course, I used an assortment of things like a hobby knife and toothpicks. These are just things that I use to either mold the green stuff or cut away plastic that I didn't want, things like that. Every good customizer should have some tools like this. You can get them online, you can get them at places like Walmart, Hobby Lobby, doesn't matter. These are pretty universally needed for, you know, custom projects and things like that. Now there was one other thing that I really prioritized when making this custom figure, and that is that I could remove his helmet and replace it with an accurate Clone Trooper head sculpt. This is where I also use that gloss varnish just to give his eyes a little bit of a shine. I'm not sure if that'll show up on camera, but it definitely does in person. I used a toothpick just to dab a little bit of that gloss varnish over his eyes after I had to repaint the pupil, just because those early 2000s Clone Wars figures had a really, really bad habit of having really weird pupil alignments on their eyes. So now that you've seen this figure in its full completed version, let's kind of peel back the layers and take a look at what went into making this custom. As I showed at the start of this video, video, this is one of the figures that I sort of cannibalized to make this figure. This is a Bantha Squad clone trooper from, I don't know, like 2012 or something. Sadly, it was pretty beat up when I got it, and it was just in the fodder bin for probably a year or more. It was missing the crest, there was some paint and stuff all over it. It just wasn't a good figure. The main thing that I took from this figure were its arms, and that is because on earlier 2008 clone trooper arms, the shoulder joint actually cuts right through the shoulder bell, and it leaves you that really ugly joint there, which I did not want. So I took the arms off of this stone mold and I attached them to a 2008 clone trooper body. Surprisingly, the pegs actually fit without any modification. The only thing is that these arms are a tad bit loose in the 2008 body. However, that's actually a bonus because I painted the shoulders brown to match the color of Mayday's undersuit in the episode, and so that looseness, you can kind of see the gap there, actually allows for this to move without rubbing that paint off where I applied it. So that is actually just a stroke of luck that I had. I didn't realize that it would work that well when I first tried it, but it worked out in the end and I'm very pleased with it. The only thing I wasn't able to salvage from this figure were his lower legs with these more detailed knee pads. I don't mind these more simplified ones, but I think the sculpt work here on these stone mold knee pads were just a little bit more accurate to the style that we see in the Bad Batch. Here's what that figure looked like before I did any sculpting or paint work. I didn't have a photo before I swapped the arms over, so this is the Bantha Squad Jet Trooper body with the Bantha Squad regular Trooper arms already attached to the torso. As you can see, that body had a lot of Sharpie damage to it, and there was really no way to save it. Otherwise, I definitely would have just added this figure to my collection. But that's one of the perks of buying big lots of action figures and stuff from places like eBay. You always end up with at least a few figures that are just so beat up that you really can't do anything with them except make a custom figure. Now, when I originally set out to make this figure, I heavily debated just taking one of my precious plain white Phase 2 clones and sculpting over it to make Mayday. However, the more I looked at the source material, I realized that most of the armor was going to be covered with sculpting, and it didn't really matter that it was, you know, an accurate Phase 2 clone trooper. It could really just be any Clone Wars clone trooper body, and you wouldn't really be able to tell the difference. However, the helmet did pose a problem, and once again, I debated, well, maybe I could just use a Phase 2 helmet and sculpt over that. But again, I didn't want to use one of my very precious Phase 2 clones, because these are quite hard to come by these days. So instead, I actually made a mold of this helmet, cast it in resin, and then used that in place of any official parts. That way, I didn't have to leave one of my clones without a head, and I was also able to make an accurate animated Phase 2 Clone Trooper helmet for Mayday. There were some things that I just could not find a good substitute for in my fodder bins, so I had to sculpt that belt buckle by hand. I had to sculpt these pouches as well, all out of green stuff. And the Phase 1 armor is pretty much identical to the Phase 2 armor in overall body style, especially when you cover a lot of the other identifying features with straps. However, I did have to cut the elbow pads down just a little bit to try and mimic the way that they are in the Phase 2 armor. That was another bonus of using these stone mold arms because they have the elbow pad attached to the forearm, whereas the previous molds have the elbow pad attached to the bicep. So just little details like that really help to sell this as a Phase 2 Clone Trooper armor set. Once I decided on all the parts I was going to use, I disassembled the figure once again, just to have everything separate, and that would allow for better access to sculpting and painting. I also had to shave off that crew cut that came on the Clone Trooper's head, just to make room for a more screen-accurate hair sculpt for Mayday. And then layer by layer I went in and added the pieces of fabric to his armor. This took a lot of time and patience. I would make a layer of green stuff and then I would have to let that dry before adding on any bandages or straps over top of that. I did not want to rush this, and I didn't want to have any fingerprints, or I didn't want to really get something looking the way that I wanted to and then try and add something over top of it and then, you know, move it out of place from where it was supposed to be just because I didn't let it dry properly. I also had to get a lot of reference photos, so I went back to the episode, I looked online, I looked at YouTube videos from the episode, and was just grabbing any and all screenshots I could of this character. I think the hardest part was actually sculpting the hair just because it was a lot of tiny details added onto a very small piece of the armor. But once again, using small amounts of green stuff at a time, just slowly building up layers and taking my time, being very patient with it, that eventually paid off. The same goes for the helmet. I had to do that in multiple steps as well, putting on those base layers of fabric that are kind of wrapped around the helmet, and then adding on top of that the different straps that crisscross over his head. But eventually it all came together, everything had dried, and it was looking really good, and it was time to finally go ahead and paint it. Once again, I kept everything disassembled until everything was painted and sealed, just to make sure that everything was the way that I wanted it to be, and also to ensure that the clear coat made it onto every part of the figure and wasn't blocked by anything. I think the most grueling part in this process was painting the pupils on that Clone Trooper face sculpt. It was very tedious. I used a toothpick just to really dot it in there with barely any paint on it, but the end result is far better than what it used to be. And after all of that, I would say this took me probably a solid 4 hours of actual work time. That doesn't account for all the dry time and stuff that I just, let this figure set out and, do its thing while I was at work or whatever. But I am very pleased with the end result. I'm excited to add this to my Clone Wars shelf. I think he will look really nice next to all of the other clones, even though I guess technically he's not a Clone Wars character. He's a Bad Batch character, and technically all of these armor modifications were made after the Empire, but either way, he's going to go on my animated Clone Wars shelf, and that is where he's going to stay. I do have to admit though, I'm disappointed that we will never have an animated Bad Batch to go alongside, the 2000s Clone Wars figures. I'm fairly confident we'll just never see that line again, and personally I probably won't be making an animated Bad Batch. However, I have seen people do it over on Instagram, and it does look really, really nice to see those 3 3/4 inch Bad Batch team members in the animated style, but I will probably just content myself with whatever the vintage collection gives us for the Bad Batch. I know Hunter is set to come out sometime soon, maybe, and he does have a more animated style than some other figures just because they basically just reused the Black Series sculpt. So because of that, maybe the vintage collection versions of the Bad Batch would fit in pretty well with a 2008 style animated figure. We'll just have to wait and see. I will definitely include this guy in my review of the new Hunter figure just to do a side-by-side comparison and see if maybe we could kind of squeeze him into the animated shelf. But until then, this is my one and only Bad Batch figure on my 3 3/4 inch shelf. Overall, I'm really pleased with how this figure came out, and honestly, that's the goal with any custom figure. If you're going to make a custom figure and you're worried about it being as good as somebody else's, or you're worried about maybe it won't turn out right or something like that, at the end of the day, all you need to worry about is if you like it. If you make a custom figure and you think it is the coolest thing in the world, that's all that matters. That's all that really should ever matter when it comes to stuff like this. You're just being creative and having fun. And if a figure ever turns out in a way that just isn't quite up to what you were hoping for, well then that's a good challenge for the next time to try and just one-up that. Every custom, every creative project you work on should be better than the last one, even if it's just by one little increment. It's a good personal goal to have, it's a good personal challenge, but at the end of the day, the whole goal behind making something like this is just to have fun, to have something cool that you can put on the shelf and be proud of. But anyways, I hope you found this video helpful and had fun watching it. I know I had fun making this figure and making this video. If you have any questions about my process in making this figure, feel free to leave them down in the comments if I didn't answer them in this video. If you liked this video, please consider leaving a like and commenting down below. It'll let me know that I should probably make more custom videos like this, because I do make custom figures fairly often. I just don't show them all on this channel, and if you want to see more of that, make sure your voice is heard, because I do read every comment, and if I see a lot of people saying, hey, make more custom figures, make more videos about them, then I will definitely be listening to that. As always, there's a link down in the description to my Instagram. If you want to follow me over there, I post toy photography, toy updates, I post links to things when new pre-orders go live and stuff like that. But with all that said, you've reached the end of this video, and that is where I'm going to wrap this up. Have a wonderful evening, noon, or night, depending on when you're watching this video, of course. And as always, I'll catch you all in the next video.